Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I feel really, it's my first time in proper Cameroon, because before I had been mostly across the border. So I'm Enrique Okenve. So I'm a doctor in African history. And I'm currently work at I've been working for almost 10 years now at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. And the University of the West Indies is a university they share across the English-speaking Caribbean, so they have different campuses. And I teach African history along with a few other courses in this university. So I started working there almost 1 year after I finished my PhD. So I was very lucky to find a position to teach African history so soon after finishing my PhD. So my research area my research interest mostly has to do with socio-cultural history. I consider myself a social historian, also a cultural historian, and so on. I mostly have been working on developments in rural communities, like all kinds of developments as a result of the impact of colonialism, the kind of transformations that follow once colonial conquest came into place, and basically the reactions. I was mostly interested not so much in the type of policies that the colonial masters will put in place to administer African societies. I was mostly interested in the reactions of local communities to colonial domination. But in particular, I was mostly interested in I focused most of my research on Equatorial Guinea, fundamentally on Fang communities in Equatorial Guinea. And I thought that was a very interesting thing, because basically I was looking at societies that prior to the advent of colonialism, they were what I tend to use to use the term self-governing communities. They were autonomous communities, almost at a village level. So I think it is very interesting to study the kind of dynamics and the impact between the arrival of the colonial state and the reaction of communities that until then had been largely autonomous. A colleague of mine a year ago was surprised to hear that I'm a historian, or that I study history, because based on the kind of history that I write, he thought I was an anthropologist. But no, I'm not an anthropologist. I learned African history later on. But anyway, my first degree was in European history, Spanish and European history. I studied in Madrid at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. So I did my first degree in Madrid. Of course, because of my interest, that wasn't enough, because in Madrid, basically, all I did was mostly European history, and I wanted to do African history. So then I moved to London, to the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is part of the University of London, and I did my master's in African history there. I thoroughly enjoyed the experience, and I wanted to learn more, and that's when I decided to come back to SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and then is when I did my PhD in African history there. And my supervisor is Dr. John Parker, and he's mostly focused on Ghanaian history. Yeah. Okay, so today, well, the main reason is because I'm starting a project with a colleague of mine, Gonzalo Alvarez Chillida. He is a Spanish historian, and we're starting a project in which the two of us are going to try to write the history of nationalism in Equatorial Guinea. I don't know, well, probably many of you know that there's nothing much, there hasn't been much history written about Equatorial Guinea, not even in Spanish. And one of the things that has not been sufficiently researched is the development and the dynamics of within nationalism in Equatorial Guinea. So what we find at the moment is that there are many sort of rumors and myths about how nationalism worked in Equatorial Guinea and how it developed, but there's nothing much a serious understanding of how it actually took place. What we know for now is that the development of nationalism in Equatorial Guinea was very much linked to the development of nationalism in Cameroon, because on mainland Equatorial Guinea, most of the population are Fang-speaking people. They had very close ties with the people across the border, and I think it's those ties with the people across the border that helped to speed up the process of developing nationalism in Equatorial Guinea. One of the leaders of the early Equatorial Guinean nationalism is Enrique Okenve, who is a relative of mine, but also there's somebody which is very well known in Equatorial Guinea, Akathe Manye, and those two are from the northern part of Equatorial Guinea and had very close ties with the people across the border. So we know that they went back and forth between, you know, Equatorial Guinea and southern Cameroon. So I've just come here to find some information in the archives, see if there's any information regarding the ties between nationalists across the border. He was I guess we can call him a great-grand uncle. He's from the same clan, Zomo, and he's from, or he was from the same district where my family comes from, which is in Mikomesen, in mainland Equatorial Guinea. So, in addition to that, to the fact that on the father's line we share the same clan, also he shared, like, on the maternal side there was also a connection. So we were also connected through the maternal line and so on. So there was always a close relationship between my grandfather and him. Enrique Okenve was older than my grandfather, but they always had a very close connection. In fact, my name is Enrique, and I'm actually named after him. It's not a it's not a coincidence. Well, the first things have changed in the past 10 years in particular, but the first difficulty is the lack of secondary literature. For anybody, any student who wants to investigate or research on the history of Equatorial Guinea, there isn't much material published. So that's the first difficulty. Second difficulty perhaps is depending on what you want to research, it could be the political situation in Equatorial Guinea. In Equatorial Guinea, we don't have the kind of a political environment that helps for researchers to move around freely and do their research freely without being inconvenient and so on. So that's another difficulty. And it's related to that. And a third difficulty is that people really, especially for somebody like me who does social history and does a lot of oral history, the third difficulty is that because of the situation in the country, sometimes people are not very trusting, and they're reluctant sometimes to speak to you and so on. And in addition to that, I think for me, for example, personally, I live and work in Jamaica, so I'm very far away, and that makes it even harder. I know that some colleagues of mine who are not Jamaican and started doing other types of history, they ended up doing something related to Caribbean history and so on. So far, I'm still sticking to my Equatorial Guinean history, and that's what I'm still doing. Yeah, there are difficulties for scholars if they want to do field work on political history or political issues in Equatorial Guinea. There's no question that it will be a difficult thing. There are ways in which you can try to overcome this. Probably what I will say is that you may have an idea in mind in terms of what your project is going to be like, and you probably have to adjust it, because the situation on the ground is going to force you to make adjustments. You will not be able to do exactly what you had in mind. It is possible, I think, but there will be major difficulties. And I will say one more thing. There will be major difficulties, particularly if you're not a local. If you're not a local, if you're not Equatorial Guinean, it will be much harder. I think you need to have the right type of contacts, and you need to find your ways around and so on. But, I mean, if you're smart about it, if you try not to be too direct and so on, I think you can try it. I don't know if anybody has done it, but when I did my research in 2002, 2003, one thing that everybody kept telling me is that, no, that cannot be done. That cannot be done. and I did it. So why not? I think it's worth a try. On the political history, and if you mean by political history the post-colonial political history, no, not directly. It is well, another difficulty that I did not mention is the lack of archival material in Equatorial Guinea. Yeah. That's a major problem. I mean, the only thing that actually helps us is that there's quite a lot of material, archival material in Spain, in Madrid, and now, as I found out, there's also material here in Cameroon, but as far as we know, there is no archival material in Equatorial Guinea that can help us. It can help researchers, and I don't know if maybe there is some material, but it's not accessible, so it's worth nothing basically. So I can't remember exactly your original question. I was trying to remember before you asked me. There was a question you asked me before I mentioned this. You asked me about political history. Oh, yes. Yeah, you asked me about political history, and I haven't really done political history. It's only now that I'm doing political history, by looking at the history of nationalism. So that's kind of a safe period. You can work on that area without a problem. There's a lot of material. One difficulty that we also had in the Spanish archives is some of the material was classified until very recently. In the past few years, some of that material had been declassified, so you can access it now. So I'm sure as time goes by, there will be more material available, and that will help us as well. And so political history of the colonial era, I think you can do safely without a problem. Political history of the Matthias and Gema era, I think you can still do. No, the Matthias is so the first president. So if you're doing the 1970s, I think you can still do, but I think it won't be as easy. Yeah. And then finally, if you're going to do political history from the 1980s onwards, no, I don't think you can do political history, especially if you're going to do it in Equatorial Guinea. If you're going to do that, you'll have to find some kind of link to material on overseas and stuff like that. You're not going to be able to do it. I'm currently working on what was originally my PhD dissertation. Initially, I was planning to publish my PhD dissertation as it was at the time, just doing a few changes and so on. But it's now about 10 years since I finished my PhD dissertation. So because of that reason, it's basically, I thoroughly revised the dissertation, and now, well, I'm finishing the manuscript. I have one chapter left. So this will be a chapter, this publication, this manuscript that I'm working on, is about the impact of the arrival of the colonial state. In a way, is the answer to the question, what happens when local communities lose power, political power? So that's what I'm trying to do by looking at tradition. One of the areas that I've been very much interested in is in the concept of tradition, but tradition as it is used in the modern concept in Africa. In places like Equatorial Guinea, people will answer many times, oh, we do these things, or we do things like this because it is tradition. So I always wanted to understand very much what they meant by tradition, and not only that, I was also aware that when people in Equatorial Guinea, and probably in other African countries, when they talk about tradition, they mention tradition without being aware of the changes that there have been since the days before colonialism. We know that quote-unquote traditional, quote-unquote traditions in Africa have changed significantly. Since the days of colonialism, and so I wanted to understand the process. Okay, this tradition that we are talking about today, how it came to be? What kind of changes experienced during the colonial era? And so in this manuscript that I'm working on, basically I'm answering the question of what happens when we lose political power, but from the perspective of how tradition was changed, how tradition was developed as an instrument to resist colonial domination. And I think in many ways people view tradition as a way to initially try to retain political power within their communities. And once they realize that they have lost political power, I think they still use tradition to try to resist colonialism and try to recover part of that. So that's the main project that I'm working on at the moment. Another project that I'm working, another project that I'm working is the one on colonialism. Nationalism, which I just mentioned. And there are a few publications. I have a publication on the development of modern Fang identity, ethnicity, and how this development, particularly looking at northern mainland Equatorial Guinea and southern Cameroon, I look at the process of development of modern Fang identity from the perspective of the connection with Elara in southern Cameroon. So that's one publication that I have. There's another publication that it's coming out soon, which is about race and racial identity. And the main issue in this publication, I think, is that I try to look at race from a different perspective. And I look at race from a different perspective because I think that one of the things that the Europeans did in Africa, and particularly in places like Equatorial Guinea, one of the things that they did is that they racialized Africans not so much because of their biology, but because of their culture. In many ways, if you look at the concept of Africans as savages, that was the main kind of ideological instrument of colonial domination. You are culturally inferior. We're here to civilize you. You are indigenous and natives, and basically we want to transform you. We want to elevate you, and so on. And I was looking at this process of the European or the Spanish discourse in this way, how the Spanish use these notions of cultural race, and how in a way made Africans feel inferior culturally, right? And so that's what this publication is all about. And there's another publication which is also coming out soon in an edited volume with the Nigerian historian Toyin Falola. And so this publication is about the island of Bioko. It is when I did my master's dissertation, I work on Bioko and the development of Bubi communities and the interaction with the Creole communities and so on. But in this article that I wrote for this edited volume, I look at Bioko from a different perspective. It has been a long time since I did any serious research on Bioko, but in this article, basically, I look at Bioko from the perspective of how this island has been at the center of so many developments. At the center of so many developments, meaning that initially it was the island where the British basically resettled the freed Africans, right, during the abolition era. Then it became the center of the cocoa production and the plantation agriculture. Also became the political center of colonial domination. And then eventually, when independence came around, Bioko remained at the center because it became the political the capital of Equatorial Guinea. So I look at it from the perspective of how this has affected the indigenous people of Bioko, the Bubi population. I will say, short answer to that question is there's no academic freedom. There's academic freedom as long as you don't refer to anything that might be related to politics and so on. So maybe if you're a math professor or a chemistry professor or engineering, there wouldn't be any issue. But I mean, if you deal with humanities and social sciences, I think it will be a much more treacherous terrain for you to navigate. And I know, for example, there are people who had been fired because of their involvement sometimes in issues that the government did not approve. One example is my uncle, Enrique Okenve. He was fired a few years ago from the university because he went to the United States and did a few talk about the human rights situation in Equatorial Guinea. Yeah. He was a professor in the university, so when he came back from those talks and so on, he was shortly after he was fired. To this day, it hasn't been properly rationalized. We don't know exactly the reasons, but basically he's been out of work ever since because of that. And that's just an example. But there are other examples. In which you can see that there's very little or very small margin for academics doing research or working in academia in Equatorial Guinea. There's not much margin, or there's no freedom, I would say. The politics of memory. Not sure exactly what you mean by that. You mean like memories as being shaped by the state, by government? Okay, one thing about it is it's an interesting question, because I will say that yes, whatever, there's some sort of like received wisdom and some kind of national memories and so on that had been to some extent shaped by the rulers in Equatorial Guinea. But I have to say that the rulers in Equatorial Guinea have not made a significant effort to shape the past, to shape the memories from the past and so on. So because of that, I will say that still Equatorial Guineans in a way have enjoyed certain freedom to create their own memories of the past. I don't think you can find other regimes, other dictatorial regimes in other parts of the world in which there's much more of an effort to shape those memories of the past. I don't think that's very much the case in Equatorial Guinea, and partly because I think the rulers in Equatorial Guinea don't really care much about history or humanities and things like that. And in a way, I would say, considering the political situation in Equatorial Guinea, I think that's a plus, because they have not meddled much, they haven't interfered very much with those type of issues. Well, I mostly focus on Fang communities, and what I found is two things. It's an ambivalent situation. You cannot say for a fact that everybody resisted or everybody favored colonial conquest or anything like that, because I think colonial conquest, the way it happened, it was a bit complicated, I think, for local communities to understand what was really happening, what was really going on, because at the beginning of the 1900s of the 20th century in Equatorial Guinea, one of the things that you see is that local communities, they wanted to establish a relation or ties with the Europeans, because they had, to them, the Europeans were a source of commercial opportunities, right? So in some cases you will see how they will favor the arrival of the Europeans until they realize exactly what the Europeans were about. And I think there's an area in Equatorial Guinea that I study a bit more, which is relatively close to the coast, but a bit farther inland. And there you see in 1915 some major clashes between local communities and the Spanish. This is very interesting because up until 1915, the Spanish had remained on the coast. They control almost a very narrow stretch of the coast, and the whole of the interior of mainland Equatorial Guinea, what is sometimes known as Rio Muni, was totally autonomous or independent. In 1915, something happened. German refugees crossing the border from Cameroon into Rio Muni. 2 Germans were murdered or attacked or were killed, depending on the sources. But anyway, they were killed at the hands of members of a local clan, Esamongon. And as a result of that, the Spanish reacted by launching an offensive against them. Why? Because the Spanish were very much concerned that if the French and the British realized that they did not have control over the interior of Rio Muni, they will say there's no effective occupation, so we're going to take over this territory. So there was, for almost a year, there were all kinds of conflicts and confrontation between the Spanish colonial army and an alliance of different clans, Fang-speaking clans from this area in and around what is today Bata, farther inland. And Bozo is one of was the leader of this movement, and people still have some memories of him. Yeah, there are other episodes, but to me this is perhaps the most interesting episode when it comes to resistance against colonial domination. Okay, first, I think there's a lack of understanding of what actually happened to us. And yes, everybody has anecdotal examples or evidence of incidents during the colonial era and later on after the colonial era. But I don't think we have a very good, a clear picture, an overall picture of the effect that colonial domination and later on dictatorial domination has had on Equatorial Guinean society. And I think some of the work that I do talks about it. Talks about, like, okay, one of the first things in my research is the issue of autonomy. Local communities have always been very keen of preserving the local autonomy. And in a way, I think if we are going to build a new society, we need to give back, or we need to take back some of that autonomy. For the past 100 years, power has been concentrated in the hands of the stakeholders of the state, basically, and I think some of that power needs to go back to the local communities. And I think societies were very dynamic before colonial conquest. And I think we need to recover some of that social dynamism. I think in the past 100 years we have lost some of that internal dynamism that existed. Issues like, for example, the article that I was telling you about race and so on, but how especially culture was targeted, how African cultures were denigrated, how African cultures were belittled. And I think to this day there's a tendency among some educated Africans not to appreciate the value of local cultures. We're still very much looking out for references outside the African continent, without understanding that there are important values in our societies. And if we look at the political culture, the political cultures that we used to have before colonial conquest, there's value there, and some of that value needs to be recovered, and so on. That's some of the ways in which I think politically some of the research that I'm doing can have an impact. And of course, there's also the sense of people's self-value. And I think anything that has to do with understanding your past and looking at your past from a different perspective, not from the perspective of the colonizers, or later on from the perspective of the rulers, I think of the Guinean rulers. I think anything like that, I think, will help us to have a better sense of ourselves and so on. There are three things that come to my mind that I'm not sure this necessarily about theory, but sometimes it's also about methodology. One thing, for example, I was telling you how this colleague of mine was surprised to find out that I was a historian. And I think when it comes to African history, I think that's a value. I think we shouldn't pigeonhole, we shouldn't just put boundaries in our research. We shouldn't just categorize ourselves as oh, I'm just a historian, I'm just an anthropologist or a political scientist. I think our research has to be multidisciplinary, and in many ways I think my research has been and continues to be multidisciplinary, and I think it has allowed me to understand some of the developments in local developments better. The other thing is also, we tend to look at our history from the perspective of the colonial boundaries, and one of the things that I have tried to do is to transcend those boundaries. And it's not just my innovation, it's just because if you look at the dynamics on the ground, those boundaries were very porous. People were going back and forth across the borders and so on. So in many ways, I don't think we should just look at this history as Equatorial Guinean history or Cameroonian history or Gabonese history or anything like that. I think we need to start looking at history more regionally. So for example, if I look at history, maybe I can look at southern Cameroon and northern Rio Muni and northern Gabon, rather than just looking at history from the perspective of territorial borders and so on. And the last issue, I think, is it's just not so much of an innovation, but I think one of the things that and it has to do with the issue of tradition and what tradition, I think, the role of tradition in pre-colonial societies. One of the things that I realized, especially when I was revising my original PhD dissertation for the manuscript that I'm working on, one of the things that I realized is that in Fang, in different areas, in different villages, when people were talking about the village leader, they will use different terms. Initially, I always thought that they were using different terms because you know, our languages are spoken in different ways depending on, you know, where you come from and so on. But then I realized that no, that they are referring to different things. And they're referring to different things because in a way, when you ask them about power, I realized that communities in Equatorial Africa, they understood power in different ways. It wasn't just power is not conceptualized in one unique way. It's not like in many ways. For example, if you look at it from the European perspective, power is thought about it from a very narrow perspective. So it's more about executive power. But what you realize is that when people use different terms in the past, that had to do with the fact that power was conceptualized in many different ways. And I think that's one of the things that we have to think about. That when we think of tradition, particularly in the pre-colonial era, we have to look at these societies as very diverse, very heterogeneous, and they will have different answers for the same problem. So they have a whole series of precedents and so on. Power is understood in different ways, identity is understood in different ways, and so on, within the same society. My last words, I don't know, I feel that I've been talking for a very long time. Well, as I said, this is my first visit in proper Cameroon, and I repeat proper Cameroon because, you know, beyond the border, I hadn't been to Cameroon. And this is something, I've been here for 3 days. I thoroughly enjoyed it so far, and I'm hoping to come back soon, not next year, but definitely in 2 years or something like that. And I think we need to do more collaborative work and so on. And one thing that is very important, I'm based in Jamaica, I'm based in the Caribbean, I'm based in the diaspora, but one thing that I think is very important that I realized in the last few years, people doing African research on African history or African issues and so on, I think we need to take into consideration, we need to give back something. Much of the work that we do stays away, and this work needs to come back here, so societies can benefit from this type of work.